Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Raising the Visibility. The topic is ethnicity. I am Carl Evans, CEO of the Hope for Us Network. It's my pleasure to have you join us for this week's live stream, the second to last episode of season 1 of Raising the Visibility. And it's been quite a journey. We've been able to talk about quite a few different things under the intersections of bias in our institutions. And today marks another step forward in an intersection that, like all the other ones, has a very visible way of impacting us. And perhaps might be one that's even harder to appreciate because of the fact that some of the impacts and effects that these blind sides can have can be misconstrued or conflated with other sort of societal issues. Whenever we're talking about things like race and ethnicity, they're always there's always going to be this, for some, uncomfortable connection between the realities of systemic racism when we're talking about this topic inside of America. But cultural and ethnic values in any country can have histories of marginalization, prejudice, things that, because they're so consistently woven into society, when you come to the discussion or intersection about mental health, it can be hard to appreciate that the impact felt there can be amplified as opposed to a general population, a more representational population that may not experience those sorts of prejudicial behaviors. One of the things that we like to talk about here is that, we're never able to encompass a whole complex topic all in one sitting, but one of the values of Raising the Visibility is this chance for us to take closer looks at complex conversations without feeling rushed or speeded through. And if you've been joining us, the whole goal behind the Hope for Us Network, of course, is proactive prevention. The goal of trying to create transformational change in the way that we practice mental health in our communities. And that's community with a lowercase c is in your backyard, your physical social space, and community in the capital C of citywide, statewide, nationally, globally. And to do that, it's a conversation about finding ways to transform not just one particular area. It's not just about getting people to feel comfortable breaking through the stigmas of silence. We also have to find ways to modify and enhance our institutions and our community spaces. And we call that the transformation triangle, because the goal of a sustainable change is something that's going to take more than just a fancy commercial or one sort of catchphrase slogan. It's going to be a commitment to changing social and institutional policies in the way that we operate on mental health. And Raising the Visibility has been tackling a lot of those topics that are necessary to transform. In episode 1, we talked about body image, and we had the pleasure in episode 2 to talk about how age can create stigmas and biases at an institutional level. And we were also able to talk about sexual orientation. And this episode, coming into today, is talking about ethnicity. And if you join us next week, we'll be talking about the economic sense of bias. But there's going to be an overlap here between this week and next week, because you can't talk about the way people could be marginalized and not talk about the economic impact. So you'll hear us from time to time talk about factors that have a relationship to the economic realities around obstacles to obtaining effective mental health care. And they come from a sense of disenfranchisement in a community space. And that's obviously an economic impact. But today's topic, we're focusing in on how ethnicity plays a role in creating stigmas and biases in our institutions. So again, these conversations are less about trying to zero in on just one thing, but talking about communities, ethnicities at large. And when we talk about ethnicity, this can be kind of a complicated topic too, because there's no one universal definition for what ethnicity means. It's kind of like a loose term. But what I'd want to draw your attention to is that there's a long college dissertation to be had about the concept of race, black, white. Race is a artificial construct that was ultimately created as a tool used for control and social hierarchies and institutional political hierarchies as well. And that's a whole long discussion that we've had before and we'll continue to have now. But when we talk about ethnicity, that's also natural to think about race too. And so we don't get confused. Ethnicity and the term culture kind of could be conflated to be the two. And I bring these two things up because we're not going to get too intensely involved on trying to compartmentalize the difference between ethnicity and culture. We want to be more focused on how things that come from people's sort of innate backgrounds and things that are reinforced in our ethnic linked or culturally based backgrounds can impact and drive stigmas or biases in our community. And what that means, what might be the difference, is that ethnically, someone could talk about growing up African American and having certain beliefs instilled in them, okay, about mental health or a number of different things. But someone could also talk about how they have a certain bias about mental health that's instilled from their participation in a religious institution. But that religious institution could have a core feature in their ethnic background. In a sort of stereotypical sense, the value or the presence or importance of the church in a Black life. Not every Black person goes to church and has that feature, but that could be a way of talking about it. And that could get all confusing talking about ethnicity and culture. So here we're kind of just expanding or making everything an umbrella term, that the things that shaped us, developed us, our identities, our grouping identities as large demographics, it's all included today. We're not going to sort of separate it out. So we're not going to penalize ourselves for having a conversation where we might lapse into talking about something that might be a cultural thing versus something that's tied stronger, has a stronger tie to ethnicity. With that said, all of our focus in this season of RTV is always talking about stigmas and biases in our institutions. So where some of our education might be focused on trying to help combat things that keep us silent internally, or trying to find ways to build legislative actions. What we're really focused on in season 1 here is talking about the ways in which spaces that can be critical to disrupting the escalation of mental health challenges, spaces that can be critical to perpetuating environments where people feel safe to self-identify mental health challenges. The reforms needed there means tackling things that could be attitudes and false beliefs about mental health that are continually reinforced. And when we talk about stigmas in our institutions, the topic today is going to be focused on one part, talking specifically about how there's a connection between ethnicity, the artificial concept of race, and culture, and obstacles to getting treatment, being validated to have mental health challenges, and even the obstacles that compel others to stay silent about mental health. And to be specific as an example about that, when we talk about ethnicity and mental health, there are statistical disparities in resources. And there's a whole drop-down list of the ways in which people, and we'll talk about using stats in America first here, people in America, for instance, identified in the marginalized populations, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people of color, they have an inequity of access to services, but there's also an inequity in treatment and supports for these populations that's statistically evident. Researching through data from Mental Health America, for instance, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are less likely to be diagnosed for a mental illness or trauma, despite having equal rates of mental challenges as individuals who might identify as Caucasian or white. This is data based from 2019. And this is just a small sampling because we're going to be talking about a lot of this as we go deeper with our guest panels today. But another instance is, if we think about mental health challenges, we can be identifying people with a diagnosable mental illness as early as between the ages of 8 and 14. Signs and symptoms could arise, and we may not necessarily see them get a conclusive diagnosis. Clinicians and experts may want to wait till they get a little older, till the frontal lobe is developed in the early 20s, but you can be screening and intervening on potential mental health diagnoses between the ages of 8 and 14 at earliest. And what that can do when you think about someone who could be experiencing any sort of genetic or biological based mental illness, if there's an awareness that accommodations could be made in terms of for the guardians, parents, the educators, the academic institutions that are aligned behind this person going from elementary school to junior high to high school, if their mental health challenges disrupt their ability to learn, to effectively interact with course material, complete homework assignments, even socially engage with their peers, if it's undiagnosed, we see a strong correlation between undiagnosed mental health challenges and adverse reactions. So somebody could have a mental health challenge that makes it hard for them to retain information, focus in school, even sit still, okay? And instead of it being addressed with compassion that a mental health challenge might be or should be addressed, it can be addressed punitively, that the student is being disruptive, they have a bad behavior, there's some sort of problem that it's on their own self-control, as opposed to they could be showing signs and symptoms of a yet-to-be diagnosed mental challenge. And that has severe consequences on the learning trajectory of that individual and the social, and if you want to take it all the way down the line, perhaps the developmental and academic and professional outcomes for that individual. And given the rate of undiagnosed or late diagnosis, people who are experiencing mental challenges at an early age and don't get a diagnosis till they're in their late 20s, early 30s, quite often, think back in your personal lives if you were going through something that the reason it was hard for you to academically perform wasn't because you were a teenager and moody, or you're an adolescent and were just hard-headed, but it was something that was disrupting your ability to sleep, to focus, to retain information, and it had to do with something that you could get treatment for, you could get supports for. Your school or your guardians, your parents could rally around you. If you had a very complex or adversarial relationship with school, think about the thousands and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals who could be going through that same experience. Well, we know there's a disparity when it comes to people of color in academic environments who have behavioral issues that are treated with discipline versus a sort of a mental health or counseling interventions. And that sort of brings me to just a sort of anecdotal story. One of our recent episodes, we talked about violence in America, mental health and violence in America, and it was inspired by a series of recent mass shootings, but it was also continuing a larger discussion about how mental health is often stigmatized whenever very publicized mass violence incidents occur. And one of the responses as a society wasn't necessarily gun control or trying to provide more accessible mental health services, even if you are going to blame, falsely blame mental health as a cause of mass violence, which is a false equivalence. There was one thing that had been done over the past 15 years as mass violence took place in schools, and that was to increase funding and the deployment of law enforcement officers on school campuses, the numbers, and not just the focus on high schools, but junior highs, elementary schools. And what's interesting is that in data that's been recently published, in late 2021, there was seen nearly an uptick of nearly 1 million arrests had been made of young minors inside of schools by law enforcement officers who might be school resource officers, SROs, things like that. And in some intensive research, there was a disparity. Youths or students of color were disproportionately by a factor of 4 times as likely to be arrested. But that the arrests, having an arrest record, was for things that in another era would have ultimately been disciplinary or behavioral issues. You know, maybe something that at most could have been a detention or a school suspension. This is now an individual who will have an arrest record, and it could be for a misdemeanor charge, but an arrest record as they're leaving high school or even junior high. And when we talk about the impact, why we talk about these things is because having a criminal record in and of itself can greatly hamper your professional and academic path, and that makes it economically challenging for you moving forward as you get older. And that continues to narrow access and resources to healthcare, to stable shelter, to food, to a whole lot of things that are considered the sort of bare requirements of creating a stable life. And this is where I was talking about before, where economics play into this. That measure of disparity because of some of these skin color and this unquestionable inequity between how a school system, which is an institution, might respond to someone's behavioral outburst. You know, we're not just talking about fighting, but someone is disruptive in class, things like that. Those responses where one might have the response of sitting down with their principal, their dean, and the guidance counselor, and their parents get called in, and there's going to be a discussion about how we're not going to have this happen again or what's going to be done to change the behavior, versus the response that they may get detention, they may get out of school suspension and lose learning time, but they could also, aside from being expelled, could be arrested. That huge proportion of individuals that have been increased in arrests, that has a severe trajectory on their quality of life. And it's all could be stemmed from mental health experiences. Not every one of them, but this is just an example of the importance of trying to study and understand disparities in how we respond to mental health. It's not just saying we need more services. We need to have an appreciation for how intersectionally we're ignoring or we're overlooking or disregarding or not validating the potential that people could be experiencing mental health challenges at the teen level, based specifically on their skin pigmentation or their ethnic backgrounds. Like I said before, this is a very complex topic, and this is just sort of one sort of way that we can make a visible case that disparities in mental health based on our ethnic backgrounds can, again, lead or perpetuate mental health crisis and rates of harm. But there's a lot more to talk about here, and even though we will probably come back to the institutional biases in terms of public education and mental health, I want to bring on an expert, our guest expert tonight, to talk about how there's a lot of different blind sides that could be created for mental health that have ethnic and cultural links. So first, we're going to bring on our guest expert for this segment, Tandra Rutledge. If I could have Tandra come on, please. Tandra, thank you so much for joining us. And before we sort of jump into things, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for having me on this evening. I'm so excited about this conversation. I am Tandra Rutledge. I'm the Director for Healthcare Systems Initiatives with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I'm glad to be with you this evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's our honor and our pleasure to have you here. And a lot of different directions to go in, but one thing that I thought might be sort of right on the nose for our part of this discussion is disparity is kind of like an underlying word here. And I found a 2019 article from the Journal of the Journal of American, a JAMA article, Journal of American Medical Association, that noted that across 10 years of survey results from the Children's Health, the National Survey of Children's Health, furnished by the U.S. Department of Health, 10 years of breaking down these survey results found that there were 3 leading responses to children not receiving mental health treatments, among other potential treatments. And 1 was a financial link, 2 was no access to school services, and 3 were the family decisions. But the strongest correlation for those responses was ones in which people of color almost disproportionately responded to one of those 3 versus individuals who did not who identified as Caucasian or white. So I kind of just want to start right there, is that, you know, from your background, what are how can there be bias in institutions? What does that kind of look like?
Oh my gosh, Carl, how can there be bias?
Yeah, well,
I know you're not asking me that question.
What can it look like? I think the most salient question is, what can it look like? Excuse me.
Well, because I think in your very well articulated intro, right? You talked about and you just really scratched the surface. You talked about systemic racism and how racism and discrimination, biases, you know, kind of those words that we use are really embedded in the very fabric of our institutions, that our institutions were built on these principles and ideas. And so for minoritized groups, that put us at a disadvantage from the beginning because they weren't built with us in mind. So let's first set that stage, right? So that from the very outset, we are, as members of minoritized groups in this country, at a disadvantage. And when we look at mental health care very broadly, what we see from the systemic discrimination and racism in mental health treatment, we see really 3 broad things. We see a history of criminalization, which you've talked about. We see a history of misdiagnosis, which you've talked about. And we see a history of poor treatment and inadequate care, which you've talked about. When you reference that article in talking about children, one of the things that came to mind for me as a mother of 3 no, I only have 2 children, of 2 Black boys. Where'd that 3rd one come from? I don't know. 2. I am reminded of 2 situations that I'll share with your listeners. 1, my youngest son was in pre-K, and I remember his pre-K teacher approaching my husband one day and asking him, "Is there something going on at home?" My husband's like, "Something going on at home? Like, that's a little personal, right?" And he didn't answer. He said, "Well, why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, I'm noticing that, you know, your son is a little off task and he moves around a lot." And now these are things I already knew about my baby. I already knew it. She wasn't saying anything that we did not already know. And I mentioned he's a little Black boy. We're taking little Black boys and we're putting them in a educational system that is really outdated in structure and really not built for success, right? For many children. And so I knew, and so my husband came home and he was like, "You know, she asked me, was there something going on at home?" I felt like that's not the question you ask a parent, first of all, right? And so, of course, it was an inappropriate question for her to ask. And I'm already mistrustful of the educational system, right? As many Black parents are when it comes to their children. So when you talk about school-based services, why would I want my child to receive services in an institution that's already biased against them? When teachers don't understand how they can perpetuate that, that bias by how they talk to parents and how they approach parents. Another example I'll share is when the same son was in first grade. We were having parent-teacher conferences, and this teacher who was a white teacher, both teachers were white, who was white, said that she noticed that my son was being aggressive. My head spun around on my neck. I think my husband, they're like fire came out of his nose, right? And of course, and I'm sure we'll get to this, I had to put my hand on his leg because he's a Black man, right? Yeah. And I said, well, tell me what you noticed about his behavior that's aggressive. So she starts to share that at recess, and we live in a community where it is the majority white, and my children, they're very few children of color and even fewer Black children. And she started to describe the boys being outside playing football. I mean, Carl, last time I checked, football is aggressive. I mean, I don't know how you play non-aggressive football. So my first question was, well, is playing football allowed at recess for the first graders, right? Can they play football? And she said, yes. And I said, well, is anyone getting hurt? And she said, no. I said, are any of the boys complaining about his behavior? She said, no. So like you, I'm confused. So what is it about his behavior that's aggressive? She said, well, I just noticed that he's playing more, his play is more aggressive than the other kids. So you mean to tell me there's no one getting hurt? None of the boys are complaining. He's playing football. He's playing a socially acceptable game. The school is allowing it. And you're talking to me about my son being aggressive, and no one's gotten hurt and no one's complained. Why would I want my child to get services through an institution that is looking at my child as, there's something wrong in my home because my child doesn't fit in a mode, and there's something wrong with my child because my child is doing things developmentally that the other boys are doing, and he's only standing out because, as you put it, the color of his skin? And he's standing out, and his behavior is being perceived very differently than the other children who don't have his pigmentation. So I think those are some of the discussions that we really have to be honest about and have, both within our groups and within our institutions, about why is it that family decision, I'm good, nope. Why that is, and that there's a long history of that, in many groups, in particular, in the Black community.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because that perfectly illustrates family decision. The CDC talks about a challenge to deal with on the disparity between people of color is their term for it is, I forget the exact term they use, but in terms of suspicion of services that they're going to effectively serve you, that they're going to recognize, appreciate, validate what you're going through. We can talk about it right in the schoolyard, but that also elevates into the clinical field too, where I don't like to bifurcate behavioral and physical health. But across the board, from mental health practitioners to physical health practitioners, we've seen the data about, for instance, Black women have pain thresholds minimized. And people might think that that's talking about just when they're going to see the OBGYN, but also if they talk to a psychologist, describing or expressing trauma can be minimized. If you could elaborate a little bit on that. So the academic is one place, but at the actual clinical level, there can be bias, and people might be like, "How is that even possible?"
So I don't know if you've ever heard this term, or your listeners have heard this term, racial trauma or racial battle fatigue. Okay, racial battle fatigue, and it's a term coined by Dr. William Smith, racial battle fatigue. And his definition of it is the overexhaustion of coping mechanisms to deal with mundane forms of racism. So it's over compromising our ability to cope because there's so much of it. So it's racial battle fatigue. I point that out because as you were talking, I was thinking about every time I go to the doctor, I put on an invisible armor because I know that I'm going to have to fight to get people to listen to me and take me seriously. As you were talking, I was thinking about when I was giving birth and how that experience, my experience of pain was minimized to a point where I literally grabbed my husband by his collar like this. And I said, you better tell them that I am in pain. Or it was like, you and I are going to have a problem right now. Like they're not listening. I stopped talking to the health providers because they weren't listening to me. And I talked to my husband and I said, make them listen to me. That is it's a battle every time. It's a battle for me. It's a battle for my children. It's a reality of every day. I had a woman who is very highly educated, PhD level professional woman that said that she has never gone to therapy for her mental health condition because the thought of sitting across from a white woman and telling her about her troubles, she couldn't imagine doing that. She couldn't imagine doing that. She couldn't imagine doing that. And I think that speaks, it speaks to lots of different things, but there is an exhaustion that even if we don't have a term to call it, racial battle fatigue, that many minoritized groups feel about getting people to see us, having our experiences validated, not being questioned about, are we overreacting? Well, could it be this? Why is it always about race? And not allowing us to experience the things that we're experiencing as being real and valid and affecting us. Racism is a mental health issue because racism causes trauma. Causes trauma. Those experiences, directly, indirectly, generationally, whatever, all of it, right? It causes trauma. It is a mental health issue. It impacts our health. There is no health without mental health. We can't detach the head from the body, we just can't. And those experiences are really important. And there's been research, Carl, about the differences in treatment as it relates to Black women in seeking medical services for pain, and how our bodies are viewed, right, as being able to take more. What? They're just like, what is that supposed to mean? You know where that comes from. We know where that comes from. And this is not something made up. This is not something that's in our minds. There was even a condition. It was called drapetomania back in 1851. An American physician came up with a diagnosis, a mental illness, a drapetomania, right? And it was a mental illness, if you will, that was given to enslaved Africans who fled, right? Who didn't want to be enslaved, because clearly, why would you want to flee slavery?
Imagine that.
It was a condition, and our medical professionals and organizations have a history of abuses and atrocities towards minoritized groups. That in the past couple of years, many of them are reckoning, but the harm that they've caused to generations of people is going to take generations for us to be able to heal from those things.
And that's, you know, very powerful and essential things that people need to hear and understand, because I think of all the critical things in there for folks who are watching right now or visit this content at a later date, I want to underscore it's not your imagination. There's some terms that I think about, because disparities, you know, in a way, in a weird, perverse way, being Black in America gives a visibility to the disparity that can be hidden if, for instance, because of the way certain cultural confrontations have happened, you think about the American Civil Rights movements, right? That can make it less visible when you think about Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities, when you think about the entire spectrum in the Latin and Hispanic communities. They experience disparities, diagnosis disparities, access disparities, academic and institutional levels. And, you know, and I'm also thinking about that, you know, if you think about it, it seemed people had to make the case last year in 2021, late 2020, but also 2021, people had to make a validation case for hate crimes against the Asian American community because of the lack of visibility they have. But why I bring these up isn't to tokenize these groups, but talking about people of color and marginalized groups as a whole. There's a concept about intergenerational trauma, which the biological thing we can dive into, and we'll do that. There's a biological thing, but I also want to talk about on the surface level of just the very idea of mistrusting your institutions and services is a very non-academic way of appreciating the concept of what trauma can do, you know, of what this can do. So I'm wondering, you know, people can hear these things and we can study, well, that's shitty and be there, but we're always about a plan of action. And from your perspective, because you're actually specifically in a role that makes an impact, what are things to combat? How do we combat these things and sort of turn the corner, you know, fight back against these sort of biases?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because, you know, it's these experiences that actually fuel my work, you know, and involvement with AFSP, right? I started out as a volunteer with the Illinois chapter, and now I get to do the work. I get to continue to do the work as part of a national team and working on Project 2025, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I think that we have to have conversations like what we're having tonight. And you talking about, you know, raising the visibility. We have to have conversations about these issues so that we can realize. One of the things is, you were talking, and I'll go back to answering your question in a moment. When you were talking, I often have this thought about how systemic racism has been so divisive to minoritized groups. And you brought out, you know, different groups in our population where institutional racism has, you know, impacted and left us feeling disenfranchised. And I have this crazy thought, like there's more that binds us. And I'm not a fan of people of color as a terminology, so you don't hear me say it a lot, but I'm going to use it for illustrative purposes here. But there's more of, if you take all the people of color, there's more of us. There are more things that bind us together similarly, but the system is still trying to keep us divided. right? And the things that I'm saying that yes, there are some very unique experiences that groups have in this country. And those experiences need to be validated and reconciled. And there are some common experiences that we all have across our ethnicities and our cultures and groups that I think that you having us have this conversation is very important. So talking about it, having more of us that look like us talking about it is important. So I think that we have to normalize these conversations, like what you're doing is one thing. And people within our communities need to see people like us having these conversations. More of us need to do that. We also, and in doing so, we need to tell our stories. And I think you have some folks that'll be part of the panel that will be doing just that. You know, we need to tell our stories, because in sharing our stories, we give one another hope, and we can see in one another within our groups and our ethnicities and our cultural groups. We can see that we can see what's possible, right? We can give one another hope in sharing our stories. And I share my stories whenever I can, so that people can see themselves in what I've experienced and they don't feel so isolated and alone. And I think that that's really important. So sharing our stories is important. I also think that we need to create safe communities, brave communities, where ethnic groups, cultural groups can be vulnerable and gather and have these conversations within groups, right? So whether it's, and we haven't, I think you talked about it in your intro, but whether it's in a faith community, because that's another layer, right? Whether it's in a faith community or it's a cultural network, like we have to build that within our communities, again, to build those connections and reduce feelings of isolation. So we're talking about things that like we can do. We also should be aware of resources that are available. AFSP has, and you know, I'll share the link so that you can share with your listeners, has a list of resources for individuals from various minority groups, not meant to be exhaustive, but a start, right? So add to it if you have resources that you want to share, you can. So being aware of resources. And then another thing that we can do is to advocate and elevate our voices and demand more, right? Demand more, get involved. AFSP has a very strong, does a lot of advocacy around mental health issues. And so demanding more from our elected officials, if that's your thing, demanding more for our school systems, if that's your thing, but demanding more. And that demanding more can even be, earlier today, for example, I was on in an IEP meeting with a family member who has a 4-year-old, and I was making sure, right, that he wasn't labeled. And I was so ecstatic when, and they're in another state, I was so ecstatic when the school psychologist said, you know, I'm really thoughtful. That tells me they've had some good training. So I'm really thoughtful about labels, especially for Black boys. And I threw my hands up, right? And she's like, so let's talk about how we give him support, right? And I'm very cautious about the language that we're going to use in this evaluation. I was like, yes, that's advocacy. So when we have opportunities to do that, whether it's with a family member or going with a neighbor or somebody, to be that support for them, because look, this is exhausting. This is exhausting, and we need to support one another. So those are some really simple, practical things that we can do. I would encourage you to, you know, this work compelled me to get involved with AFSP. AFSP has chapters across the country. The Illinois chapter is thebomb.com. And I know we do a lot of work around issues like this and have these discussions. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in that to get involved and reach out to our Illinois chapter. Okay. I don't know if that was answering your question, if that's what you needed or wanted.
That's right on the money.
Okay.
And first, absolutely a shout out to AFSPs getting involved in the chapters. The network has the pleasure of working directly because we're operating out of Chicago with the Illinois chapter, but you can't ask for better, more extensive resources and a way to start your journey on being an advocate for not just Black line item, or exclusively the line item of mental health and suicide prevention, but the drop-down menu to actually make, real change, because it's more than just remembering to let people know about a lifeline, which is essential, but there's a lot that's got to go into it. And I want to go back to something before we go into our panel to talk about 2025. Just a little bit. If you could tell us a little more about that.
Yes, I would love to. So Project 2025 is AFSP's bold goal to reduce the annual suicide rate in the country by 20% by the year 2025. And through some pretty extensive smart stuff, I'll say, with some leaders in suicide prevention field, AFSP, along with others, identified 4 critical areas where we can implement some very specific evidence-based strategies that can actually reduce the suicide rate in the nation by 20%. And the 4 areas include healthcare systems, emergency departments, firearm-only community, and correction settings. That might be another episode for you at some point, Carl. And for the purposes of our conversation tonight, part of that is through a lens of, ethnicity and making sure that the most vulnerable in, our country are getting their needs met, recognizing that many people have been disenfranchised by our healthcare system in particular. And so AFSP is committed to making sure that all communities have the resources that they need to be healthy and to be whole, and that together we're able to save lives by implementing strategies in those 4 key areas. I will also, because I know we're on a time and you have an amazing panel coming up, I will also share with your listeners a link to Project 2025's website, where you can go on and get some additional information about the project. And who knows, maybe we'll do a segment. You'll reach out to the Illinois chapter if you're interested in talking more about the project in the future.
Fantastic. And we absolutely will. We at the network, is our mission in being proactive and trying to provide training and education on building proactive approaches. 2025 Project 2025 is an essential target. It's an aspiration, and it's a goal that we consider ourselves, aligned with. And so I'm very glad that we had a chance to talk about that, because this can all feel hopeless in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, talking about mental health, suicide prevention, it seems like a very large mountain. But breaking things down into these sort of tangible targets makes the reality that much more visible, a much more visible approach. And as you preface, we have a wonderful panel. So, Tandra, if you have the chance, if you'll honor us with sticking by, we're going to take a little detour, break into a different segment, and then we're going to come back with our community panel. So everyone who's watching right now, thanks for joining us, and get ready for the community panel, which we're going to be having in just 2 minutes or so, 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you, Tandra, so much.
Hey, Jester, what does stigmas mean?
You've never heard of stigmas?
Nope.
You ever feel like you can't talk about how you're feeling?
Yeah, sometimes I don't feel good, but I don't want to say something because I feel silly.
You're not alone, Blooper. Many people feel like they're supposed to hide their feelings. Some can feel silly, even ashamed. It's like their own fault for feeling bad.
When I feel down, I don't want to talk because everyone around me seems fine. And I don't want to bring them down.
Things that make us feel bad to talk about our mental health are stigmas.
Oh, I get it. But who made stigmas, Jester? Like, where do they come from?
Stigmas try to control how we express ourselves. And when it comes to mental health, stigmas are false beliefs about how mental health works.
But Jester, who makes stigmas? When did I catch them?
Stigmas don't come from one person or place. We all have inherited stigmas through social and cultural factors.
Social and cultural factors?
We all get stigmas by false beliefs about mental health being repeated by friends, family, and in pop culture like TV.
How do I stop from catching stigmas, Jester?
It's not someone's fault for being influenced by stigmas, but we resist stigmas by understanding that our mental health is a natural part of life. And having a mental health challenge is just the same way in any other part of our body is unwell.
You mean like if I catch a cold or get hurt falling off my bike?
Exactly. There are many things we can do to take care of ourselves. And there are professionals who can help us with mental health challenges. In fact, the Whole Person Network's mission is to help folks like you and I learn this early signs of mental health challenges, and so we can do something about it before it leads to harm or complications in our lives.
Early signs?
Remember Blooper how stigmas make us silent?
Yep.
It's common for people to hide their mental health challenges until it feels like it's too much and they reach a point of crisis.
Well, if so many of us are impacted by stigmas, that makes us hide our mental health. It's almost like there is a culture of concealment.
Yes, Blooper. You could say when it comes to mental health, we all live in concealment culture.
So, the network wants to help people address their mental health before they get to the crisis?
Exactly, Blooper. Proactive prevention is all about disrupting mental health challenges from escalating.
Oh, awesome! How can I join?
You can become proactive by connecting with the Hope For Us Network.
I really want to make a difference.
Together we can. Come on, I'll help you.
And we are back. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Network Buddies. So next we're going to be bringing in our community panel. We're going to have everyone get on screen and they'll introduce themselves. Thank you for, again, joining us for Raising the Visibility Ethnicity episode. So first, what we're going to do is, Tandra, are you still with us? We're going to bring Tandra right back, if you recall, our guest expert for the day. Long time no see. Good to have you back. Next, can we have Marlo on, please? Marlo? Hello? Brianna? Is Brianna on? Brianna, what's good? Jen O, are you with us? Yo. Pete? Mr. Pete, are you with us? And is Scott, did we have one more? Is Viki with us? I don't know. Maybe not. No luck. Okay. Okay. So this is our community panel for the evening. Thank you all for joining us. And first, we're going to do a little round of introducciones and see how that goes. So we're going to start with Pete. Please let the audience know who you are.
Hi, I'm Peter Renwick. I love the topic right now. I mean, I have a very good insight since I'm a Korean adoptee, and I'm just excited to share some stories.
Okay, Pete, we're getting a little scratch little robot scratch there. I don't know if you've got a connection issue, but we'll see what we can do. It's all right. Your voice sounded a little scratchy. Sounds like I do in the morning. We'll come back to that.
Is this a little better?
A little hit or miss. If we need to if we need to troubleshoot a little bit, we'll work it out. No worries. Jen, what's up? Please introduce yourself.
Hey y'all. My name is Jen. I'm calling in from Boston area, although I'm from New York. Tandra and Carl, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I scribbled down about a dozen different things that just really resonated, so I appreciate you both. Intro. I bike a lot. I'm an escape artist by nature, and I work in public health, so I'm very much into this mental health is physical health and everything in between, so I'm happy to be with you all.
Thank you for joining us. Brianna?
Hi, I'm Brianna Kelley. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. A lot came up just from listening to the both of you talk. I'm really excited to join in on it.
Thank you for joining us, Brianna. Marlo?
Hi. I also, that was amazing. So much resonated, and I'm very excited to have this panel and have conversations about this. But where I'm coming from, I grew up in Mexico and moved to Chicago around 22. So it's just been a discovery process in exactly this subject. So
Thank you so much for joining us, Marlo. And of course, Tandra, reintroduce yourself in case somebody just showed up for this part of the segment.
Yes, I'm Tandra Rutledge. I'm the director for healthcare systems initiatives with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Fantastic. So to get the community discussion going, we're kind of pivoting from directly talking about institutions to more talking about how we've observed, experienced, come to know the impact from the institutional side, but also from the personal side. We can't have this kind of discussion without talking about our personal or the personal element here. And I just want to sort of bring this up as a sort of starting point. The World Health Organization, attached to the UN, began doing global studies on suicide and mental health at large rather recently. Their first major suicide prevention report was published in 2014. They've certainly talked about these issues in mental health before. But since that landmark global study, they have, in ensuing years, published updates. And the most recent update on a global study of suicide among member nations of the UN was published in 2019. I bring this up because in every one of their published studies, they've come to the same primary conclusion about the biggest obstacles to effective suicide prevention. They will note in the drop-down list that funding, representational care, those things are essential, but they continuously advise that the number one primary obstacle, it's always page one, top of the list, is stigma and taboo, which I'm just going to read verbatim from the WHO 2019 report, says stigma, particularly surrounding mental disorders and suicide, means many people thinking of taking their own life or who have attempted suicide are not seeking help and are therefore not getting the help they need. The prevention of suicide has not been adequately addressed due to a lack of awareness and prevailing social, cultural, and ethnic stigmas and taboos. So moving into our community panel, I kind of wanted to just talk about what does this look like and sound like as we've seen and experienced it in. The way I wanted to take a small bite to this for our panel, because from our guest expert thing, we kind of talked about a lot of different facets here. I would like to talk about, from the cultural perspective, I find that there can be places that are sources of strength, and then there can be places that are sources of bias. So I'm going to give an example. I've kind of, typically in these panels, I've kind of thrown everyone to the wolves and asked them to start, but I will start. Okay, so sources of bias. Okay. When I was in elementary school, and this is to sort of protect the living educators who this is about. In one of my earlier elementary years, I had been taken to being called on the schoolyard, being called poo face. And it certainly wasn't in the, these weren't, my school peers weren't doing it, they weren't covert Klan kids or things like that. I was the only dark-skinned kid in the class. If there was taunting, that's what came out. We're all under the age of 9 and 8. So I'd go home crying. I really hated it. Okay. This is 1991 to 93 area. In a parent conversation with my parents and the teacher and me, when this was expressed, like, hey, this is happening, what can be done about it? The teacher said, very matter-of-factly and with very much a sense of like being compassionate, well, isn't that just something he's going to have to get used to? So the response from the family side was, no, that's not something you get used to, and you're not wrong for being angry about it. Okay, source of strength, right? That's not a bias. However, free and clear of my family and all those kind of things, I, played sports, whatever, and I never had like the classic stereotypical chauvinist dude bro running around, but I got it pretty early in my head, the whole idea of like boys don't cry. So in dealing with a lot of my mental health challenges, I had a sort of mentality of boys don't cry, which as I started to associate with, I'm biracial, as I started to associate stronger with the black side of my family, that became reinforced as brothers don't cry. And it wasn't meant as a way to feel ashamed. It was meant as a way to protect yourself and strengthen things. So that would be like a source of bias. It's not to villainize those family members who perpetuated that. They were saying it at a place of love and a place of trying to give me strength. Don't ever let them see you cry. So that would be an example. Can any of you think of, from your experiences, maybe a space of, we'll start with a space of bias or stigma, and then we'll go to the sources of strength. Anyone want to jump in there? Anybody?
I'll jump in.
Brianna.
Like what came to mind when you're talking about that is kind of like the stigma of like talking about your mental health issues. So for example, like don't let, the rest of the family know, or like don't let your friends know that you're depressed or that you're experiencing mental health issues, like because they're just going to think there's something wrong with you, or like it can be shown as like something is wrong within the family when that's like not true at all. Like it just, I'm actually very open about my mental health struggles. But it came after, trying to keep it concealed. And that kind of just like made things worse, because I think people, like when they're not aware, you're kind of portrayed as a certain way because they don't understand that maybe some things that you do is because of your mental health struggles. And it can be perceived wrong. And also just like not talking about your mental health struggles makes everyone else feel alone.
Perfect point. That's a really good point, because there's no prejudice to mental health. Everyone under the sun in any hemisphere and of any melanin content is going to experience or potentially have the experience for diagnosed with illness or traumas. But there's also this sort of like the way culturally or ethnically that we respond. The fact that you said about don't telling people, that's a really interesting thread that seems to echo in a lot of people's like upbringings, is sort of keeping it inside the home, or because it's almost like, never mind your own personal harm or struggle, it's a reflection of the family, the family integrity or something. I see heads nodding. Does that sort of jump out for anyone? Marlo.
So I guess I should put a little bit of a trigger warning on this one, but when my attempt happened in 2018, I was hospitalized for a couple of days, and a while later I found out that my father had told my family that I like what is it called when you drink too much alcohol and that's why they take you to the hospital?
Alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, that I had alcohol poisoning. And it was just this moment for me of like how messed up stigma is, because like here it was my dad preferring to say like, oh, my daughter's like a drunk or like whatever, like that stigma might like alcohol might carry and stuff, than saying like, my daughter has been asking us for help for so long and like now we're just going to act like we're so surprised and so confused at why she's been acting in the weirdest of ways and stuff. And it's just like, oh, so you mean my entire life, like my entire life and everything that's been there obviously hasn't been enough, but this is so out of like, you know, normal from me or whatever. And yeah.
That's a really good point. And thank you for sharing that with us. The concealment, like the network buddies, we talked about it. It's something we spend a lot of time. The culture of concealment isn't just a monolithic thing or an umbrella term. It's each one of us could experience our own cultures of concealment, and the dichotomy between choosing alcohol and the challenges of addiction with alcoholism, which is serious and not to be light with an attempt on your own life, is a very brutal, graphic illustration of what we're facing here.
The cascading effect of that, Marlo, is immense. And I can definitely, I think, relate to it in a different way. But I grew up with a parent who had a mental health issue, bipolar disorder, alcoholism. So the family's survival tactic was keep the peace, which is very helpful in helping people get through it. But what it also means is silence and suffering. And so you never get the validation that's so important to feeling like you're not alone. And I can see that just through the decades of keeping the peace. And then when you're finally looking for a community who can validate what you've been going through and help you with what you're going through, you might be 3 decades into life before you find it. And it's not until you're validated that, at least for me, I felt like I finally had a voice. And it's such a long time to go, but it all comes back to the idea of stigma, keeping it in the family and just protecting the family and protecting yourself, but you do yourself so much more harm.
And there's something to be said there. There's a lot of cultural baggage that comes with the idea of the individual and the family unit, right? And protecting the family identity at the sacrifice or detriment of your own identity. Pete, I don't know if you're roboting or you're nodding. Did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, it can. Am I coming through better?
Yeah, you're coming through better. Even if your video slows down a little bit, your voice is coming great. That's great.
All right, awesome. Hi, I'm Peter. I have a very interesting insight into. I'm a Korean adoptee. I was adopted from Korea at 3 months to 2 wonderful white parents. And I grew up in a predominantly white community, but my parents did a really good job at embracing my culture and who I was. They facilitated many opportunities for me to learn about my culture. We went to out of Itasca, Illinois, and they also would do adoption days at school where they bring in stuff from my culture, like games and food, and share them with the kids. So kind of really like just embracing who I was. But I, growing up, it was being older and looking back on it, I definitely see that there was a lot of race towards me, racial jabs toward me that I didn't even know, and kind of tried to beat them to the punch, mostly in sports. I'd have all these different racial nicknames, such as Rice Burner and Fast Skitty Wheels and stuff like that. So I kind of beat them to the punch and gave my nickname Sweatshop. Yelling it on the baseball field probably wasn't the best, but then again, I don't know if it did me any good. And it kind of, I guess, looking back on it, it created some interesting feelings. and that, you know, I pretty much am on the inside very white, but you know, on the outside I look different. So right out the gate, I'm already at a disadvantage. I work in a Hill school as a special ed teacher, so I do see the racial stigmas that go with IEPs and being diagnosed. Actually, in second grade, my second grade teacher tried to get me diagnosed ADD, but being a second grade boy, it was just, you know, me as a second grade boy. So I've felt many things, and I'm just happy to share my stories with all of you.
Thank you for sharing that, Peter. And that, you know, one of the ways that it's hard to appreciate for mental health experiences is that the cultural intersection can kind of rob you that these are mental health discussions. Sometimes you can be sitting there, and Tandra, you talked about this in the earlier segment, but I want to talk about the way we express ourselves and how, because mental health, you know, aside from the genetic and biological realities and trauma, which we at the network we talk about as psychological injuries, beyond the chemistry and the medulla oblongata and all that stuff, mental health is an expression, right? It's our thoughts, feelings, and emotions expressed. And controlling how you express or get policed on your expressions is one of the more less appreciated ways in which our mental health can be impacted. And when it comes to people who, especially if you're from a marginalized culture, policing your expressions, you know, is a gigantic feature. You know, I'm not just in code switching. You talked to, again, I'll use a personal example. Tandra, when you talked about anger, I have worked in environments where I'm people who might know me would not describe me as a violent or bullying person or what have you. Okay. I've worked alongside people for 2, 3, 4 years, 5 days a week, intensive amount of hours. And there was a particular situation in a previous nonprofit I worked at in which we were having a very passionate discussion. It was not a combative discussion. I was making a passionate point about the trajectory we were going, and I did something to the effect of like, we're gonna get there. We're gonna kick ass. It was literally that tone, right? Flash forward to the following week, and the only 1 or 2 people who were above me in this organization had me a sit down in a corner, corner me in a sit down and say, hey, look, we've got an issue we got to talk about. And I was in the room with, like, these are board members, and people who said that they felt intimidated, felt I was bullying, felt I was being hostile, and it made them scared. Now, I'm not physically, I am not a small person, but I'm not the only passionate person who's in that room. I'm not the only heavier set person who's in that room. But that's not the first time I've heard people describe my, excitedness as aggressive and angry and intimidating. And it gave me the feeling of, you know me, if you know me even for a little bit, and maybe this is being arrogant, but violence and threatening and bullying, I'm willing to bet, are not on the top tier of things you'd ever guess I'd be. But your ability to reduce me immediately to that is something, whether it's cops or it's teachers, it's followed me my whole life. So that's a form of expression. And again, I gave you a context in which we were not having an argument. We were all like cheerleading. And somehow my like, yo, was like, calm down, Negro. Like, it just, so I don't know. I just think about that. If anyone else can sort of see how their expressions have been, manipulated into being something else. I think that's relevant here. I feel like.
I would love to say something. I was actually thinking about this when you guys were talking earlier. And I was just thinking about like the workplace and how, I've been in meetings with people where someone who is not like a person of color will roll their eyes during a Skype meeting. And, it's just seen as they're being passionate or like they really just don't like this topic. But if I were to do that, or someone else from a different background were to do that, they're automatically looked at as aggressive or like they have an attitude. And I was just like, sometimes when you've been discriminated and traumatized in the workplace for so long, it's hard to not express your anger. And I was thinking about this that I pulled up that I reshared on LinkedIn a while ago when Ketanji Brown Jackson got in the Senate, and someone said it is time to acknowledge that the praise for being poised during times in which those from historically ignored backgrounds are being abused is itself abuse. And I think that's like such a powerful statement, because in like situations where we are being criticized, or you know, there's something coming out that we're passionate about and we're defending it, it's seemed as a threat and very intimidating. Like I remember a specific time in the workplace where something came up about race, and I was the only person of color on my team. And so I started talking about how like I felt. And then someone else was just like, well, I don't want to play devil's advocate. But it's like, you know, you can't express yourself without becoming a threat when someone else is just looked at as being, you know, passionate and expressing their opinion.
That's such a perfect point about that. I mean, I don't want to jump in here if others want to sort of piggyback on that.
Well, I will share. There are a lot of things. Everyone, first of all, thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing your truths, because, you know, there's a lot of things that I can relate to in what everyone has shared this evening. Carl, I want to go back to, you know, kind of what you were talking about a moment ago about the policing of emotions, you know, and the policing of our, you know, our bodies. And, you know, it is exhausting. You know, it really is exhausting. And Brianna, you mentioned Judge Jackson, and I remember not even being able to watch. Yeah. And I couldn't watch because she was smiling. And she was smiling, and I was angry. And I didn't want her to smile, because nobody would be smiling under those conditions and under that treatment. And it was, for me, it represents a dichotomy that many people of color face. It represented a dichotomy that I face on an ongoing basis in the workplace, in the boardroom, wherever it is, where not even the policing of my emotions, but where I have to self-police, as well as the frustration that I feel when I recognize how the cultural conditioning that I've received, that I pass down to my children, that I'm trying to undo. Because when you talked about Black men don't cry, that's not just a man thing, but it's a survival thing that's been passed down for survival, because you couldn't cry, right? That goes along with the stereotype of the strong Black woman. There's a history of that, but it's killing us, because you know, the resilient Black woman, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, right? Like, but that is something that has been both, you talked about in your intro, sources of strength and sources of bias. I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of my cultural history, you know, and where I can draw strength. But that also is a source of bias, because the expectation of that history is that I'm strong. But where is the allowance for me to take care of my mental health and not be strong? And why do I have to teach my Black children, my Black males, how they are supposed to interact with white people and how they can interact with Black people? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to teach them that, you know, that people will treat them differently based upon how they speak? Why do I, in my white community, have to encourage my teenage son when he's coming home from work and school and living his life to be thoughtful about how he wears his hoodie? In my community, why do I have to do that? So those are some of the things I think when we're talking about mental health. And Carl, you did such a good job of, because one of the things notes I wrote down is let's define mental health, and you did it perfectly a moment ago. So we don't have to do that. But there is this intersection with our culture, and I think that all of us here talking have realized that there are some things that we can draw strength from in our culture, and some things that, you know, we recognize as biases, and we're trying to combat those biases in our culture. And as we do that, you know, for me, I know I am unlearning those things. And that creates vulnerability for me and for my sons, because there's a risk, a real risk, a risk of death. I mean, I'm just going to say it. There's a risk of death. You know, remember when I shared earlier, I said when we were meeting with that teacher, I put my hand on my husband's knee because I knew that Carl, if he started to speak and show passion, that she would get intimidated. And afterwards, I said to him, I said, it's less of a risk for me to intimidate her than for you. There are times in my community where I say, no, I'll take the boys somewhere because I'm a little less of a threat just because I'm a woman, even though I'm still a threat. So I think that it's very important as we have these conversations to look at that intersection of our mental health and culture, and all the things that I think contribute to it. And I think this has been really, I think the audience will really glean a lot from this and start to question things, right? So why is that, right? And where does this come from? And then how do I try to change it in the work that I'm doing?
I'm so glad you articulated that, because when we think about, again, going back to the essentialness of self-expression, there's this whole thing about, and this goes across the whole, I'm going to say this for everybody who ends up marginalized, not just Black folks, because it comes across as the model other, right? So Black folks got to be a model other, but there's the model immigrant factor, there's the model, you know, Pete, in what you're talking about, there's a duality there for, you said internally I'm white, and we can do the college dissertation about like race as a construct, but we also inherently know what that means, though, because there's a model. There could be the model Asian. There could be the you know what I mean. So like, I kind of want to talk about that because that's a controlling factor in your expression too. The strength thing, toxic resilience is something I wish. Resilience as a toxic tool is something I wish would just drop into the abyss. Okay, I don't want to say die or drop dead, but like drop into the abyss. But I kind of want to continue on that line from what you brought up, Tandra, just talking about the pains of being the model, you know, insert there. I'm just starting that now. Does anyone sort of feel a little bit of a link of just hating that experience?
Yeah. I like going back to like the strong Black woman. Like, I'm Puerto Rican and Black. I come from family with a lot of very strong women. And that's, you know, how everything is portrayed. But I love when like people talk and say, I don't want to be strong and resilient anymore. Like, I want like softness, and I want like care. And like, that is just like so beautiful. And I think like when I say, because I always think like, I always tell myself, I'm like, I'm a strong person. And then I'm like, no, you know what? Like, I want softness. Like, we deserve softness.
I love that. To that, you know, that's kind of another thing about it is there's an external factor, you know, living in systemic racism and things like that. But even internally, like the ethnicity part, things just we inherit from our families who mean well, which I kind of talked about at the start here. If the resilience is outbound into society and code switching is outbound, there's also expression controls we do inside of the household, right? And that can be, there's a family dynamic. You could be the youngest born, oldest born, or things like that. But even just sort of like maintaining a normalcy to your whatever your guardians or your family is, and making them not think, like making them think everything's okay because you come from a culture where mental health is not talked about. That's another form that's hard to appreciate that many people experience. I don't know if anyone had any experience, like Marlo.
So and it kind of ties back also to the silence thing in this case for me. I was thinking about it, and you know, growing up in Mexico and being like the youngest and being assigned female at birth, and having two older brothers who were like 9 and 11 years older than me, like I was the one that got, you know, shut up since I was a child. Like they could say anything to me, anything. And then when I said something and stood up for myself, it was like, you can't do that. You know, like the countless times I would get up and like not eat with them and like move to a different area to eat. Cause I was like, I can't, like, what am I supposed to do at this point? I can't say anything, you know? And like growing in that. And then I remember just like watching things about the US and being like, women can like talk there, like they can like, you know, like the USA. And then I got here and, you know, all the things happened. And then I ended up being in a long relationship with a white woman. And it was like this it took me a long time to understand this was happening, but it was this moment of like, oh yes, you're a woman. No, you're Mexican. You can't talk because you're loud. You're this. And like, it ties back to all of those things y'all were saying of like, I think when I got to the US, I thought I like got my voice. And it's just like looking back and realizing like, no, I started being afraid of my voice. I started actually like feeling so much guilt about everything, because now it wasn't only like guilt of like, oh, I was born this way or something. It was also like, oh, my experience is all wrong. Like, because I didn't grow up here, I didn't like learn the things that I should have or whatever, you know, like it's not like I deserve like this, you know, shame comments or these types of stuff. And like, it's so wild to me just how much, you know, we talk about like everything's mental health, and like it is, you know, this growing up in silence will lead into setting ourselves up in situations where we are silenced again, and when we are, you know, emotionally abused over and over again. I think it's one of the hardest things I see in, you know, my community with, you know, being Latinx and people of color and everything. It's just like this shame we're just carrying and carrying and carrying from one generation to the next generation, and we're all just so ashamed of being everything that makes us the most beautiful, amazing, beautiful beings we are, you know, like we're literally ashamed of the most beautiful parts of ourselves. And it's just, yeah.
Thank you. That's something that I think is important for us to understand, is that one of the hard things is that even though we're focused here in an American-centric discussion, the bias and stigma on mental health, again, save the college dissertation, the long history short is that it comes from the false belief that we're 110% in control of our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So that if you find you're struggling with something that ultimately fits a diagnosis for mental illness, or you're coming from an experience of trauma, if it's disrupting your quality of life, you can look back thousands of years and so on and so on. If it disrupts your quality of life, it's seen as a reflection of, going down the list of, either it's a reflection of lack of physical weakness, it could be moral or character weakness, it can get up to the level of a reflection of some sort of impurity or failing of your literal bloodline in terms of a divinity sense of things. And we're living in an era where science has let us understand, you know, chemical imbalances are a thing, and trauma is a thing. But what we're unpacking comes back down to the echoes of strength, of the belief of control, of all that kind of stuff. So to us, as we're going through something, one of the most brutal things, your voice, being able to stand alone as an individual human being, which is a powerful sense of strength. We're also imbued with, whether it's you're living in America, and so it's all the baggage of systemic racism. But think about globally too, in a sense. Any place you land, people, as a point of survival, reinforce for your sense of personal and moral, and if divinity or spirituality is in their spiritual strength, this silence and concealment. And I'm kind of teeing something up here to, I'm not trying to pick on somebody, but I also want a little bit of perspective, because one of the reasons, Jen, I invited you in here too, is because I know your work takes you out of country, and I've had the privilege of knowing Jen for almost 20 years. And few people have I ever met who are as inherently willing to humble themselves to learn and to be someone who seeks understanding, as opposed to, and this is being totally frank, be a force of colonial do-goodism in the universe. And I kind of want to just bring that in here for a second, that you shared something with me earlier in some of your earlier overseas work that made me help appreciate that when we think about mental health stigmas, they're not just exclusively to, I grew up where we were once slaves and, now we got to hide to not get shot, which is reality. But even in homogenous environment, people can have mental health reinforced, and you can't blame it on European colonialism per se, but it's still, different language, same silence. I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I have no idea what anecdote I told you. But I work for a public health organization, and I travel a lot for work across Asia, Africa, Latin America, basically everywhere, across the US as well. But when I think of mental health in other cultures, I always think of, honestly, Rwanda, because I spent 2 years living in Rwanda. It's a wonderful place. It's been through a lot of tragedy, and the mental health care and treatment there is really, really interesting, and also just really heart-wrenching, because obviously they've been through a genocide. Every year they go through an annual remembrance of the genocide, and there are no government-backed institutions to support mental health care. I think like in the entire country, they might have like 3 mental health providers in a country of 10 million people. And so like formalized mental health care is not something that exists. And so people don't access care, and there's a lot of PTSD. Even in the language, there's a term that means like komera, or like be strong or endure. And people say it for everything. They say it if you're working out, they say it if you're suffering, if you've been attacked, if you're ill. And the idea of suffering to endure for always is like embedded in the language usage in the country, which I always found to be really, really fascinating. And it's just, it's a challenge. Like PTSD is real. Trauma reflections are real. And what you see a lot are outsiders, people from any other country coming in and thinking they know how to treat the mental health of the people in that country, when they have no idea what they've been through. They don't understand genocide. They don't understand the relationships people have with each other, with the land, with their country and their president. And there's an assertion of what Americans and Europeans think is best practice mental health care on a country of people who don't want it. And so there's a lot of like colonialism pressing down. There's a lot of presumption of who gets care and what care looks like. And the reality is that it's very personal and very individual. And it's not something that I think is easy to understand. I don't know if that's just a rambling narrative, but it's one of the countries where I always think, I think about quite a lot.
And that's the reason why that's critical. Why I said that in any language, silence continues, is because of the fact that when we think, coming back into like an American-centric attitude about this, where there are systems that have existed long before we were ever born or we were a glimmer in our parents' eye, it can be hard to appreciate just how intensively sort of stigmatizing behavior on mental health is inherited by the people who care the most about you. And it's funny that you said that, Jim, because Khmer was actually the thing I was bringing up, is that is from a language that most Europeans were still figuring out how to not defecate in a cave. Yeah. And that language was out there as a sense of core strength, and it gets passed into this other thing. So I come back to this idea of like the game face that people put on. People who love you the most could be reinforcing, or people who say they love you the most, or structurally they love you the most, right? Could be reinforcing something that could be to your detriment when vulnerability, Brianna, I'm so glad you brought that up. Vulnerability can be the gateway to healing for so much of what we need. And I just think about all the different ways, again, back to expression that gets disrupted. I kind of want to talk about code switching a little bit here. I've danced around it, but I just think that in terms of expression and communication, I feel that the way we try to, and it's policing, but the way we try to like game face ourselves. So traditional sense of code switching obviously can be, one voice with your friends, one in the corporate sector or whatever. But I think self-expression code switching, which I don't know if that's a thing that's talked about on Tumblr yet, but like, I think that's a reality too, because a simple example is like, take the stereotypical with the boys, it's one way, and then with your significant other, it could be somewhere. If as a hetero cis male, that's an example, right? But I feel like we even do that in like a household, whether it's our house, like we own the house, or living in somebody else's household, that we like can code switch our emotions as a, and Brianna, I was thinking about this, what you were talking about with the way it is in your family, and I don't necessarily have a family that I would describe as being toxic to mental health, but I know that I would be more open about my mental health because there's some family environments where it's benign. It's like, hey, how you doing? How's your day? What happened next month? Oh, you're going to a trip there? Great. And that's as deep as it's going to go. Yeah. And that's all anyone's asking for. And there's no like toxic like aggression about it. It's just kind of like, we don't anything more is like no, like no. So I don't know. I just think about that. And Jen, you talked about it too, like in your household. So that's a mental topic that I just wonder about if that's anyone else can relate to.
I wouldn't say it's like toxic. It's more so like the beliefs that have always been ingrained, and like that's something that we're all like vulnerable to. Is everyone is taught something going down the line, and like it's some of our jobs to unlearn all of that. And even now I have family who talk about their mental health, and it's like 10 years ago or something, it's like when I was talking about it's completely different now. And so like it does, when you do see change, it's nice to like see all of that and how like generations are breaking that unlearning that has been instilled throughout lifetimes.
Brianna, can I ask, I'm curious if you've had this experience in your family. My dad is this like 72-year-old burnt out hippie who like recently was describing to my sister a lot of these feelings that we would characterize as like anxiety. Like language fascinates me, but he's like describing palpitations, can't sleep, like the fluttering. And my sister and I, who hold like the bulk of the emotional intelligence in the family, were like, that's anxiety. And my dad's like, I've never had anxiety. But the idea was that the word, he never understood what the word meant until he was experiencing it and someone gave him that label, and it like blew his mind. And we were like, anxiety is normal. Like we talk about it, we have it. And he was like offended to not know that his daughters recognize they have anxiety and could talk about it freely. So I'm curious, as you're breaking down the silos in your family, if you've had something similar come up, because that boggled my mind that this 72-year-old was like, what's anxiety? I never knew that I had it.
Right. Probably not like in my direct family, like my immediate family, but like I've definitely had experiences with, other family members and even like friends. Like I'll be taught, they'll say something like, I'm going through this and this, but I'm not depressed. And I'm like, it's okay if you are. Like, it is okay. And, or it's kind of like, they don't speak on it until I'm like open about it. So, for example, I've had like someone talk about someone else who was experiencing mental health issues, and I would be like, and I don't know if they were expecting me to say like, oh my God. But I was kind of like, well, I struggle with that too. And then they were like, yeah, I think I might struggle with it too. And it's like, people aren't open to talk about it until you're kind of saying, it's okay to be like that, or it's okay to experience
that. I think that's a really good point, Jen. That a great question that you asked. There are two things that Brianna highlighted that I just want to emphasize. One is we're talking about what do we do? How do we give people hope? Is to be willing to talk about mental health ourselves, right? And that's what Brianna described. And that's really important. And the second thing that she said is, in your question, is around language, right? And so as important as it is for us to recognize anxiety and depression, it's more important to get people to talk about how they're feeling, right? And in your example, Brianna, you talked about like a friend, like you're like, but I'm not depressed. You would be hard pressed to find, and I'm generalizing here, all right, a Black woman that's going to say that she's depressed. She's going to say she's exhausted, she's tired, but and it may not even be stigma, right? It may not even be stigma. It's just like, I have so many things to do to survive, right? I'm holding the world together and I'm tired, and not even recognizing how all of that weight, stress is creating and producing symptoms that the medical community would call depression. And so we can have a conversation about stress and feeling overwhelmed. And I can say, I feel like that sometimes too. And then as Carl mentioned earlier, I think when you first started, is it interfering with your ability to go to work or go to school or care for yourself, right? Does it seem to be, are you having other kinds of thoughts, with that? And so sometimes just like getting folks to open up, and you were talking about your dad and you said, oh, that's anxiety. He was like, oh, I don't have that. Like that. It's probably like a totally foreign concept for his generation, right? Like, what is that? When you know that that's, clearly what it is. And so language matters, I think. And I found in my family and, with people I talk to who are close to me, I'm very careful as a clinician of medicalizing it, because I am a therapist. I don't think I mentioned that. Because I am a therapist, I'm very careful about how I have those conversations to not do it from a medical lens, because they always are like, are you trying to analyze? No, I'm not trying to analyze you. So I have to work extra hard to not have people feel like I'm diagnosing them.
Right.
So
that's essential. I'm so glad that you're able to put those things together, because and continuing on the language thing, that's one of the things that we do. Brianna's been through our education work. I don't know if anyone else has, but one of the things we'll do when talking about being proactive is we say, well, stigma rules everything around us and it's this big obstacle, but getting around it, you've got to combat the realities and environment. So we take the word, and I mentioned it earlier, we take a thing like trauma, and at the network we advise, not because trauma's a good word, it's wonderful, it's staying, it's not going anywhere, right? But like we appropriate the term psychological injury when we're asking people to have mental health conversations, because, and this is like if we're training educators, because you ask someone to look in their face and say, have you ever been traumatized? Okay. And what stigma does is it creates the illusion about the hierarchy of mental health. It creates a whole bunch of different things. So you think of trauma and somebody will think of like very visible, intensive things, a plane crash, mass violence. And then they'll think about their experience, which might have been a decades-long, passively aggressive, verbally abusive parent. I'm like, no, I'm not traumatized. No, you know, and explaining to them psychological injury, think sprained to broken bone. Because, and I'm bringing this because, Tandra, when you're talking about the strong black woman thing, really think about it to that level. Because you hear, I'm tired, I'm burnt out. Think across your entire planes of existence, every one of you. And, you know, extrapolating outward of like the stress and strain, you know, pandemic strain, economic strain, etc. You're going to lifting weights, you could pull a muscle. You could be in perfect functioning health, but twist an ankle, pull a muscle, and it's an injury. And you didn't have to have a long, persistent history of trauma to have an injury now. Or you could have been living with something that was like a twisted ankle at one time, and lack of addressing it, you know, overcompensating, because one thing we do for unaddressed mental health is you overcompensate, whether it's manifested as substance abuse or, you know, projecting aggressions and things other places. So again, just the essentialness of language, building those connections can wake up someone's mindset. That's one of the things you have to do, is kind of unravel that. And it makes me want to ask a question. Pete, you talked about looking back, you kind of realize sort of the racial problematicness with people, you know, calling you nicknames and things like that. Was looking back, if I may ask, did you have problems with finding or building connections with your Korean culture growing up? You know, looking back, did that create issues, like trying to find that connection? Or do you feel like you were able to navigate to build your own connection? You know what I'm saying?
I mean, I believe I have like a connection to my culture. I don't think it's as strong as it could be, because like I mentioned, that Korean adoptee camp was only like 1 week a year. So it could be stronger, and I would love to look into it. Talking about my parents who are great at embracing it, they also are cut from like an older cloth, and it was like, let's not talk about our feelings in the house, you know, whatever. So I was going through some issues in high school, and they actually suggested counseling, and what came out of counseling was I was able to share some of the issues that were going on. I wanted to actually quit baseball, which was kind of making me stressed out because there's so much pressure in high school sports, way too much pressure in high school sports. You know, so when I shared that and they were okay with it, I was like, oh, wow, I need to share, you know, I need to speak out more. Now, you know, growing up 16 years, you know, not really sharing the feelings, I mean, it was really hard to break that, and I didn't continue the practices, and I'm still struggling with that now and working on it. Cut to this year, there was a older gentleman substitute teacher, and I was helping out sixth graders. And if you don't have a visual, I'm 5'3", the average size of a sixth grader, seventh and eighth grader. So I look like a student. I blend in. So you know, at the beginning of class, it was we're working on sewing, and you know, if you've ever, you know, try to put a needle through a thread through the eye of the needle, that's like impossible to students these days. So I was up trying to help all these students, and this older gentleman sub said, "Hey, boy, what are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, you know, I'm just helping students thread the needle. You should be sitting down, son." And I was like, "Oh, sorry, I'm just helping students." "You are a student." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, okay." So right away, it escalated a situation that could have been just addressed quickly. I mean, I was red in the face, but I did keep a calm, cool, collected composure and just said, "Sir, I'm a teacher." And he goes, "I don't believe you. I'm calling the principal to come in here because I think you're messing with me." So my principal had to come and calm him down. And then he claimed, oh my goodness, I couldn't figure out how to turn on the TV. So, and from that experience, I shared it with my other teachers. I shared it with my spouse, and just talking about it more, it made me realize how wrong it was, but also how good it felt to talk about it with someone and have them, you know, kind of talk me off a ledge, and just help me calm down and also see the wrong in that. And that's why, you know, as a teacher, I tried to facilitate any conversation around race that I can, because I'm in a great position to try to change minds and try to open conversations. And again, if I change a couple students going forward, I feel like I've made a difference. I mean, I know I'm not going to be able to touch every student and change their minds, but I'm doing my best.
Peter, thank you for sharing that. That's, you know, and that illustrates another thing there, that it echoes back to what Tandra brought up in the guest segment, and we talked about it a little bit more. You sharing with other people and them validating your experiences, like, yeah, you should be jacked up about that. The brutality of like gaslighting ourselves of you know, how many of you have had a situation where you went through something like Peter and it got to you, but like you kind of like gassed yourself down, but you talk to one person or other people are like, wait a minute, that was fucked up. And you're like, I don't know, has that ever happened to you where you did? Because and I, to be perfectly frank, I can't even necessarily chart this as an ethnic thing or whatever. I think just as a societal thing about our mental health, I think we can get like just shook out of something. Peter, thank you so much for like illustrating that, because that's the kind of stuff that can get to us real bad too, is things that we minimize its actual impact. Like we rob ourselves of being able to process it. Or does anyone think of something like that?
Tandra talking about medical care had me living it up earlier, because I can't, this is obviously for me, I'm extremely white, not related to anything racially, but going to the doctor and having a rupturing ovarian cyst and having white doctors routinely white male doctors tell me that I just had gas and send me home might be the most infuriating thing in the world. And I'm sorry to say it's happened 4, 5, 6 times. And after a certain point, you think, why am I trying? And that's even just my experience. As a Black woman, I honestly, even getting in the door would be shocking, because you know automatically that they're going to tell you that there's nothing wrong, you're overreacting, and to go home.
Jen, just real quickly, just what she said, hearing her, just listen to what she said. She said, why do I even go? That's why so many people, especially, you know, from minoritized groups, do not seek health care, because why even go? They don't listen anyway, because they're going to tell me it's something that it's not when I'm feeling this here or that this, and this keeps coming. This keeps happening. Thank you for saying that.
It is such a fight. And when you mentioned the racial battle fatigue, it's so much work to go in and push yourself to fight for yourself every day. And you just add on a lifetime of fighting. It's exhausting.
And imagine that intersectionality of layers of identity, of experience, of all of the things that you have to layer on. And it just makes me want to go take a nap.
Yeah.
I mean, a real nap. Like I just want to go to sleep and take a nap.
And if people can't, I'm sorry, Marlo.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, thank you. Sometimes I need, like, this is going to sound weird, and I'm sorry if it sounds weird, but sometimes I need, like, a different white person to, like, validate an experience that I had with another white person. Does that make sense? Like, right now, that was so validating to me. Like, my entire emotionally abusive relationship, my ex-partner is so like, why don't you go to the doctor? Like, what is wrong with you? You just want to be sick. You just want to feel bad. Like, these are excuses. Like, I have a chronic illness, you know, so, like, a lot of stuff goes wrong sometimes. And they're mostly things that, like, don't need a hospital. So I just avoid it. And but just hearing that and just somebody saying like, I get it, and I can't even imagine what it's like for people that look differently. Like, that's just, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you, Marlo, for identifying that. And I want to double down on this layers of identity, because as I said, at the very start of this episode, intersections aren't nice and neat. Why I brought up the whole ethnic and cultural thing is because there's overlaps. And layering, just for if you're watching right now or visit this content at later dates, layering can be the economics, it can be body image. We did a whole episode about body image and could do 10 more episodes. Gender identity, orientation comes into play here in terms of engagement with all institutions and services. Medical treatment, but your academic experience, your professional experiences. And this is kind of, I think, a good, healthy place to sort of wind down tonight. Is in talking about the fact that no one conversation on mental health is on an island. And for you, if you're watching right now or visit this content at a later date, you don't have to fit into one little silo for your challenges or your obstacles to speak out, be relevant, and validated. Okay? There should be, and if it feels like there's a lot, that's because there are a lot of intersections with whatever you're going through. And what I want to do is sort of, as we're sort of going to bring it to a close here, because we can never get everything we want, but I think we've done a good job tonight of having a good conversations and sharing stories. Is I'd like folks to, if you feel comfortable, of course, talk about something that Bree, you've inspired me to ask tonight. Sort of, Bree, you shared how in sharing your stories you found, even if people didn't make a declaration, oh my God, Bree, you've opened up our family to mental health. Leading with your truth, as Tandra talked about at the end of the expert segment, sharing your stories is powerful. And saving the big billboards, fancy commercials, a "We Are the World" song for it, one of the most direct, powerful ways to change the game on mental health is sharing our truth. So with each of you, I'm going to ask you a prompt question that's what gives you hope. But I'm not talking about in the toxic positivity sense. I'm asking what gives you hope in the sense of it keeps you inspired to stay in the fight. Even we got to take breaks and be vulnerable. What gives you hope? That's my sort of ending question for the night. Does anyone want to drop in first? Putting people on the spot. Anybody?
So I think I'm in a great position as a middle school teacher, as a one of the only Asian Americans that's working in the district, to address or if a situation arises, make it a talking point instead of a punishment yelling at you. Just open the conversation and make it open. I also am a father of a half Korean, half white baby, and I'm raising her to be open and honest about her feelings, as well as trying to share what I know about my culture with her, so that she can maybe help her classmates as she enters the school systems, and just trying to make it not taboo to talk about race, because it's all around us and it needs to be addressed. But also, if the things that people say and do have a lasting effect, and if we can push people to like this to be open and honest and share stories, it creates healing for other people, and so moving forward, just being able to share those experiences, as well as telling people it is okay to tell someone that was wrong to say and it hurt me, and that's I'm especially at the 6th grade level or the middle school level, it's much needed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well said, Peter. Anyone else feel comfortable sharing what gives them hope? Stay in the fight. Marlo.
I think you're muted.
I guess it didn't sound cheesy because you couldn't hear me. This is gonna sound really cheesy. I am the cheesy person, the one that cries on every episode. But honestly, meeting people like you all, like I feel like sometimes when you surround yourself with the people that aren't looking to, I'm trying to phrase this the best way, better themselves in the way they affect themselves and others and stuff, like you forget that there are people that are also trying out there, that there's just so much. And thankfully in the last like 6 months of my life, I've had like the opportunity to meet more people that are out here and not giving up, because all of us could just give up any day. It could just be like, this is it, I'm done. Like I'm done with like the fight. This is overwhelming. I'm just gonna pretend and like smile from the background. And like, no, we're like choosing to voice these things, no matter how much people have tried to stop that from happening, how much people have tried to stop that light from like existing. Like we're still doing it. And that is just, I think, the most inspiring thing, or like thing that gives me hope, is knowing that there's more. And this all just reminded me of one little phrase from, I think it was one of the first live streams I did with the network, and it was with Rick, and we said, some need to yell so others can whisper. And that just really stuck with us, because it was like my answer to like why I started the podcast. And some of us need to be loud, and we have to get louder. And if we can just help one person be able to, even in the most silent way, even just to themselves, talk about what's really going on inside, like that's already a win. If that's the one thing we do in our entire lives, like help that one person voice it more just by yelling out who we are, like that's hope to me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marlo. Who's next?
I can go.
Brianna.
I think like what gives me hope is that there is change happening, and there's a lot of unlearning happening. Like we have so much learning to do, but we also have so much unlearning to do. And just like what keeps me going is just like when I first started talking about my mental health struggles, I was like surprised at how many people open up to me about their mental health struggles that I would have never known were struggling as well. And so I think, just like how Marlo is saying, just opening and talking about the conversation is helping other people not stay in the silence.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brianna. I really dig that.
I can go. It's hard to sum up hope, but I think I'm with Brianna in that just speaking it out loud is such a tonic, because I think for a long time, the question of who's allowed to have trauma was that it's not me. I'm not allowed to have it. It's definitely not me, but probably others. And realizing that I'm allowed to have experiences and vocalizing them makes other people feel like they aren't alone. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I feel like I'm at a place where I can vocalize it, understand it, and then speak it out so that I'm helping hold the weight of others and they can help hold mine. And it feels very empowering.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sean. Tandra, we end where we began.
Well, I would say what gives me hope, very simply, is having honest conversations like this about mental health. You each here give me hope, and I celebrate each one of you and your journeys and your work. And I thank you for your vulnerability. And Carl, I thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm not even going to say that it does not feel like 2 hours. My ADD did not kick in. So I am really, really, really telling you, you did a good job, because I would have been doing some things and Peter knows about ADD. He works with those kids, and it did not kick in. So great job tonight. So each of you all give me hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tandra. And we're going to be closing tonight. You know, on that note, I want to say that I am inspired by all of you. And if you're watching right now or engage this content at a later date, I want you to think about something. Tandra talked about AFSP's 2025 goal to reduce rates of harm and suicide with a statistical number and not just an in general thing. And when we think about that goal, if you watched the Network Buddies segment earlier today, we talked about concealment culture. And mental health crisis and harm is found in the gap between the onset of an issue and the distance to treatment. Anything that is a mental health challenge is a natural, organic part of your body. It's part of your reality, okay? It's not some strange alien thing that makes you broken or disturbed or fundamentally undeserving of life, okay? There's no magic wand, and treatment can be difficult and years long and prolonged. But starting that journey begins by breaking a silence. And Brianna, you shared something that you talked about, and Marlo, you also iterated this about unlearning things. And if it's not too confusing, one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest successes we can have is to learn how to unlearn what we've learned that's toxic and makes us silent about mental health. Say that 10 times fast. And to do that, it takes exactly what Tandra talked about in the guest segment here, which is to share our stories. And I talked about this in the guest panels, and I'm going to say it again. Beyond focusing on the billboards and the fancy commercials and all those other things, you look at a thing like AFSP's Out of Darkness Walk, and anytime people put groups together digitally, physically, to share about mental health and specifically about suicide prevention, you're talking about because mental health has been a topic that's been shrouded in darkness for centuries and generations, passed down from culture to culture. And as it was stated here tonight, telling your story illuminates. And there was a saying by Queen Mary I of England who said that truth is the daughter of time. And in the quest to fight for improving the stakes on mental health and suicide prevention, our stories light these beacons, and that truth is what gives hope to so many others. So one thing I hope you can take away from this amazing panel and our guests tonight, and from any other work, anywhere you go, is to take your story and these stories with you and share them with others. Don't let your mental health conversation end tonight. Carry it forward, because together, by telling all of our truths, each one of us a beacon in our own communities and spaces, we can alight the world anew. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight as our most honored guests. I want to thank our incredible panel, Tandra, Marlo, Brianna, Jen, Pete. And unfortunately, I think someone had to drop out earlier who couldn't join us, but I want to thank Viki in spirit. High fives to you. I want to thank our production team, Scott and Christina, and a shout out to Ben, our operations manager from the network. On behalf of everyone, I hope you have a wonderful night and take care of yourselves and each other. Good night, everybody.